Hi everyone! In this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a toucan in pastels. Now, like with any animal, the first thing I like to do is get the eye drawn in, and I want to start by making sure that the size of the eye and the shape of the eye is accurate. You can also see here that I have drawn in a little bit of the lighter reflection at the top of the eye, just so I know that I've got that in place and I don't have any dark pastel there that's going to darken up or contaminate that light area. If I have a particularly bright highlight on the eyes or the nose of any animal, I will usually put a white or a very light grey in there first. I can always darken that up later if I need to. Now, once I was happy with that, the next thing that I wanted to do is work on the beak. Now there you can see I'm explaining the pencils I'm using. I'm also creating a little colour swatch to test my colours. Now this is available as a full-length real-time tutorial on Patreon, so I've got a voiceover here while I'm drawing, so every single process is explained thoroughly. Now what I was trying to do here is capture the shine on the beak, given how this is a smoother surface. Now some beaks of certain birds, some parrots for instance, are going to have more grooves and indentations, more texture on their beak, but the toucan here had much more of a smoother appearance. So I had to make sure that my highlights are nice and well blended in with the yellows. So you can see there that I was using a little bit of a white Rembrandt soft pastel stick to really reinforce that shine. Now, in order to make anything look shiny, whether or not it's metal of a dog collar, leather, anything like that, the contrast has to be right. So in terms of the contrast, it's having bright highlights and dark shadows. So at the top there, I made sure to put in my white with the Rembrandt stick, and here I'm now making sure that the dark part of the beak is also very dark. This is going to help to build up the three-dimensional shape of this part of the portrait. Now the other reason why it was so important to get the contrast right here is because this photograph, the eye and the chest feathers were in focus, but the beak was a little bit softer and almost slightly out of focus. Now the body, the feet and the branch of this bird were even more out of focus, so more blurry. So I really wanted to make sure that I had that balance of details on the face and then these soft edges, which is why I'm now going back in with a very small paintbrush there just to soften up some of the edges of the beak. Now this real-time version of this tutorial does focus on all of the techniques that we need to use when drawing animals with fur. So we're using lots of detailed work, which we'll get to when we work on the chest feathers, but all of the layers that I'm building up here on the beak are all about the layers of subtlety. Now this is so important when drawing fur. So if we start off with a base layer and jump into drawing our fine details, even if it is the texture on the beak here, it's not going to have that rounded three-dimensional shape. So we want to be building up and paying very close attention to the mid-tone shadows and highlights. Here is a prime example where I'm using some slightly darker oranges to reinforce the mid-tones and then just adding a little bit more shape to the edge of the beak. It might only be one extra layer and only in a small area, but by adding that shadow there, it's helped to create that three-dimensional look of that one element of the portrait. Now when we combine all of that together over the rest of the subject, that's when everything comes together when the portrait's finished and we end up with a very realistic finished drawing. Now one main element that this tutorial on Patreon focuses on is how to keep your vibrant colours looking vibrant and well saturated with colour. What we don't want is when we have these lighter vibrant colours up against dark portions such as the eye or the beak here on the lower portion, that those colours mix together when we're working up against both of those areas and then dragging some of that dark pigment into those yellows or greens in this situation. So I wanted to show how to keep that vibrancy and prevent any of those layers from becoming muddy. Now this is something that can happen very easily when working with pastels, especially with oranges, reds and yellows. And one big tip for that and maintaining that colour saturation is don't use a really dark layer for that first base layer. Now for my layer here I used sanded soft pastel sticks because I didn't have a vibrant yellow in my pan pastel set, but pan pastels would have worked really well for that first layer. But now when I go in and darken this section of the feather, I'm doing it gradually. I haven't used any black. If I use black to darken a yellow or an orange, I'm going to end up with a really muddy section. And it's very hard then to get that yellow colour back over the top. You can also see that I'm paying very close attention to exactly where those shadows should be placed. I'm not putting it in a large area because again, I want that colour either side of that shadow to be nice and vibrant. If I put that dark layer down in a place where it shouldn't, it's going to be very hard for me to get that back looking as bright yellow as I currently have here. So this is why I'm a bit more cautious when working with these colours, and I do like to make sure that I'm thinking a little bit more about my layering process. So something I speak a lot about in all of my tutorials here on YouTube and my in-depth tutorials on Patreon is the importance of the base layer. Now I believe this is our foundation for our details, so I like to make sure that that first layer, it hints at where the shadows and highlights are. They should be accurate, and I want to make sure that I've got the transitions from lights to darks nice and well blended. I don't want there to be any harsh lines. Now I do feel that that makes my detailed work when I come to add additional layers look smoother and softer. So I do just feel that that's why one of the main reasons why a portrait can look more realistic if the base layer foundation has been given the amount of time it needs. Now of course we are going to be layering a lot of layers on top, but it just means then that we've got an accurate base layer to work from. I therefore find that I also follow that reference photo more accurately because I've already taken the time to map in exactly where the lights and darks are. Now one main reason why I like to work in this way is the highlights and shadows are not random. The placement of those are very specific. They follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. So for instance, the darker greens around the bottom of the eye, if I'd have lowered those shadows even by 0.5 centimetre, I'm going to make the eye socket look wider or deeper than it actually is, which would mean then that that eye could potentially have what looks like a bump or a mass rather than just the skeletal system underneath the skin and feather. So this is something that I do want to pay very close attention to. So now the bulk of the detailed work had been done on this portrait, I'm going to move on now to the outer focus section of the body. Now here I'm going to be adjusting the pencil technique and using some softening techniques on the edge of the bird to make sure that I don't have any harsh edges. You can see on the right side at the moment that's a very harsh edge. I don't want to leave it like that because it makes the bird look in focus on that part of the body. So once I'm applying the pastel, I'm then going to work with some softening tools to then really push back those edges and help blend that slightly into my background. Now a big tip when working with blending or softening techniques is don't over blend. I don't want to make that section of the body look really blurry like the greenery in the background. There is needing to be a bit of a balance there. So once I've built up some softness, what I'll usually do is take a step back from my easel and look at the portrait from a distance, maybe 1 or 2 meters away, and then I can see, is that soft enough? I don't want there to be too much of that blurred edge because the bird's just not going to have the right look. So it is about finding a real balance. Now the legs of this is where the feathers were starting to overlap the background, but they still needed to be out of focus. So what I don't want to do here is draw pencil strokes and leave them looking harsh, because the body of the bird would then be out of focus, so you shouldn't therefore be able to see the highly detailed feathers that are then poking out on the side of the leg. So we do want to be making sure that any of those details that do overlap onto the background are also softened. So the feet part of this Patreon tutorial were one of the more interesting parts because there were a lot of highlights and shadows that we had to capture accurately in order to make this foot look like a foot. Now when we draw hands, feet of any animal, a person, anything, I do find that they look very odd until they're pretty much finished. So I would always recommend to just map in your lights and your darks, start off as I have here, putting in the darker creases of the knuckle area, add in your highlights and then fill in the gaps in between. You'll probably find then that by doing it that way, once you've got pastel down for that entire section, that it actually looks like a finger and then it gradually builds up to looking more like the hand or the foot. If I build the individual areas up into layers, so I look at one hand, one foot, and I do my base layer, then the next layer on top, and so on, I do find there that then the hand or foot does not look realistic because we've worked on too much of a larger area. So if we map in the main lights and darks first, just like when I'm mapping in my base layer of the rest of the bird, if I do that for the feet and focus on the main structures of each of the fingers or the toes, that then it makes it far easier to draw. I don't then get stressed because I'm not quite sure which toe should be where. Now the other thing with this is not only did I have to map in those knuckles and the highlights, the shadows, but I also had to soften them as well. So I made sure to map them in and keep all of my edges harsh. Once I was happy with that, I would then work with my softening techniques. I wouldn't do both of them at the same time because I would therefore blend some of the lines and they would potentially shift in their placement. It might only be by a couple of millimeters, but when you're working on fingers or toes, that's enough to make that foot or that hand look really odd and like out of proportion. Now the very last element on this portrait is of course the branch. Now I didn't want to go with something that was really detailed and force lots of texture because the branch is also out of focus. So what I'm doing here, exactly what I've just mentioned with the feet, is I'm adding detail, but then I'm going to work on softening that detail and pushing it back, but always being very aware of not to over blend, because otherwise this is just, it's gonna then look too fake and artificial. I don't want this to look like a pipe. It still has to have texture to show that it's a branch, but softness to it as well. Now the lighting on the branch is important. You want to make sure that you map in your highlights and shadows, particularly by the feet and underneath the bird, to follow that light source. So if the light source is coming from the left hand side, you're likely to have a shadow on the right side of the branch because the body of that animal would cast that shadow. Without the lights and darks, the branch is going to look more like it's floating and that the animal isn't perched on it. So the lights and darks are really important. So I really do hope that this tutorial has been useful. If you would like to draw along to the real-time version, you get the reference photo line art, full material list, as I said, with a voiceover while I'm drawing, so every process is explained thoroughly. Then I will link my Patreon in the description below. If this video was useful, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. And if you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. Here's a finished photo of my drawing, and I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube next week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.